All else being equal, the simplest answer tends to be correct. The anarchist position is very simple, actually. It's just the defense of this simple position that is complex, in the same way that debunking creationism is more complex than explaining evolution. Anarchism is this: if there is a demand for X, X will be supplied to the extent of the demand. Demand: willingness and ability to exchange resources for X. A self-sufficient person is thus both demand and supply in whatever he is self-sufficient in. If the demand for clean river is greater than the demand for place to dump industrial waste, then the river will remain clean. The belief in the state is a supply shifter and can cause one side's demand to be supplied easier, tipping the scales in favor of whoever can lobby the state the best, and guess who that typically is. On this little river here, you have the factory and the various river residents. By however property ownership is delineated, these are the ownership plots of the residents and of the factory. If the factory owner tries to dump waste into the river residents have three choices. Try to pay off the factory owner, probably the equivalent of the cost of properly disposing the waste. Try to convince the factory owner that he would make more money by selling homes along the river, which would more than offset the cost of dumping waste into the river. Or they could use force. Oh, but the capitalist has much more in the way of war-making abilities than the river residents. That objection is not necessarily relevant or true. First, war is expensive and uncertain. If the cost of war and all the aftermath is projected to outweigh the cost of proper disposal of waste, then a profit-maximizing firm will not go to war and instead choose to dump somewhere else. Also, the capitalist does not necessarily have more war-making abilities, as the river residents may be aided by any sort of outside help. That is, there may be demand among outsiders for the river residents to win, for whatever reasons those would be. In other words, war is not a good business plan unless you can get someone else to pick up the tab. That is, get someone else to do your fighting and pay the taxes while you get defense contracts and tax breaks. Or in the old imperialist days, a monopoly over an entire country. Also, when comparing the value of dumping sludge versus the value of a clean river, I'm not talking about money. The value may be monetized and expressed in monetary terms somehow, but it's not necessarily monetary. It may be more profitable in total money terms to pollute the river and ruin the real estate. That is not what I mean by value. Warlordism. Anarchy will just devolve back into feudalism, they say. Remember that the state is maintained primarily by ideology. Most people buy into the state ideologically. This is not necessarily wholehearted, gung-ho, flag-waving support. All that is needed is for the population to be resigned and pay their taxes and to view the state as some inevitable law of nature. If they positively support the state as well, that's just icing on the cake. So the bulk of the state is maintained by ideology. If we look at feudal Europe, we see this was the case. Especially back in those days when the Lord literally just had swords and shields and a few archers and like a stone castle wall and some horses. There wasn't an incredible disparity in power, especially since there were a lot more peasants. And the peasants didn't need to subjugate the Lord or go defeat the Lord in the field of battle. They just needed to be enough of a pain in the ass to be free to where the Lord would no longer find it profitable for him to go out and constantly engage the peasants. There's no way the Lord could have ruled over the peasantry by force alone. Just like a rancher really can't rule his cattle by force alone. Luckily for the lords, medieval peasants were really, really stupid and believed in the feudal bond and that God wanted them to work for the Lord and the Lord was necessary for order and that some lordship was inevitable. It was an inevitable law of nature. A similar dynamic can be seen in the protection rackets in New York to the extent that they existed. You have some immigrants show up in New York and all of a sudden some guys come up to them and say they need to pay protection money. Why didn't the state intervene? Simple. Tammany Hall, under Boss Tweed, was bought and paid for. And because everyone in New York believed in the necessity, legitimacy, and inevitability of the state, people couldn't just opt out of the New York State Police Service and just form their own, just like they can't today, which is why pigs are pigs. However, even the most powerful and intoxicating ideology will not garner 100% support. There will always be a few fringe elements, and these people are dealt with by the marginal state. Usually just the threat of the marginal state is enough to keep the fringe elements underground or on YouTube, like we see today, which is just how the state likes it. The state does not like to use force. They do not like to reveal the marginal state, as this undermines the legitimacy of the ideological state. All that said, why wouldn't warlordism/feudalism come to dominate a stateless society? Well, first is opportunity cost. Would being a warlord be a better, more profitable, and safer lifestyle choice than all of the alternatives? This is why the freer the market, the more opportunity cost there is, and the less likely one will choose to become a warlord. Sense of right and wrong. Believe what you will with that. People leaving the warlord's land. This is a rather obvious problem with modern-day feudalism. This is why warlordism/feudalism is uneconomical in a non-agrarian economy, and immediate disintegration would be the result if it were tried in a modern economy. One way to solve this problem would be to tie the people to the land, like in serfdom, but I won't even bother going into the impossibility of doing that today. Serfdom was a stretch in an agricultural economy like medieval Russia. Today, forget it.